I am honored to introduce our keynote speaker, the Right Reverend Nathan Dwight Baxter. Bishop Baxter's life is a testimony to faith, service, and leadership across the church and beyond. Born in Coatesville, Pennsylvania in 1948.
I know I look it.
You look good, right? He was raised in a family deeply rooted in ministry and Christian education. After serving his country with distinction as an Army medical corpsman in Vietnam, he pursued theological study, ultimately earning both a Master of Divinity and Doctor of Ministry from Lancaster Theological Seminary, along with more than 20 university awards, including 8 honorary degrees. Ordained in the Episcopal Church in 1977, Bishop Baxter's ministry has spanned the parish, the seminary, and the national stages. He served as a parish priest in Virginia, in Pennsylvania, a professor and dean at Lancaster Theological Seminary and the Episcopal Divinity School, and chaplain and faculty member at the historically black University St. Paul's College. In 1992, he was installed as the 8th Dean of the Washington National Cathedral, a position once held by Bishop Walker, as we know. During Bishop Baxter's tenure, he guided the cathedral through some of its most historic moments: presidential inaugurals, national memorials, including the service of prayer and remembrance after the attacks on September 11. In 2003, he stepped down as dean of the cathedral and returned to central Pennsylvania, where he became rector of St. James Episcopal Church in Lancaster. 3 short years later, Bishop Baxter was elected the 10th bishop of the Diocese of Central Pennsylvania, where he shepherded the church through times of significant change, always with wisdom and great care. He also shaped the wider church as a mentor for new bishops and as the founding convener of the Episcopal bishops of African descent. And I'm happy to say it's a growing list. I do their oral histories and I can't keep up. Throughout his life, Bishop Baxter has embodied a ministry grounded in service, scholarship, and a deep love for God's people. An example of the type of ministry modeled by Bishop Walker. Please join me in welcoming the Right Reverend Nathan Baxter.
I'm so very honored to have received this invitation for many reasons, but particularly given the times that we have and what's going on in our country. And I got a phone call from your dean, and I know he's very concerned about what's going on in these times. And so he said, "Nathan, you're troubled." He said, "But do you believe in free speech?" And I said, "Oh, yes, dean." He said, "Would you come and give one?" I don't know, dean. I am truly honored and grateful to have my partner of 56 years, Mary Ellen. I love jazz, and that's one of the reasons. Before I say that, I have an announcement. Our own Rose Duncan, who has served the cathedral for many years on worship. She has been named the presenter, which means both worship and music. And she has that title. And I just think that's extraordinary. You know the difference between a terrorist and a presenter? You can negotiate with the terrorist. All right, so in jazz, there is such a thing as riffing. And it is when musicians in the band, or usually it's a smaller group, not a whole orchestra, but they find ways to play off the theme, but then come back to the theme. So it is all inspired in terms of where they are as the theme of the main song is going on. And often each one will riff and do their thing. And so I share that to say, I thought this print was small. Okay. I say that to say that as I think about Bishop Walker, my greatest interest is to ask the questions about leadership. Leadership that he inspired, maybe things we may not largely know, but help us in these times, because his times were very much like our times. And so even though ours is much more expanded in certain ways, but it's the same kind of things that were going on in our times. So I want to focus on the witness and legacy of his leadership and lessons I personally think his God-given gifts and his very human graces might offer to us who seek to be faithful leaders in our time. And yes, I'm sure, Maria, that John would be appalled, but I think of him as a saint. I really do. And I think of him as a saint not because he was perfect, no, but that he was an imperfect looking glass that reassures us of the glory and power of God in our own time and work of leadership. And just the evidence of all that's gone on today is just a small piece of that remarkable life. But as I said, he would not want to hear it. But indeed, just as an icon, you read an icon, you look into it, and you see what is it saying to us. When I first met Bishop Walker, I was very surprised. He always seemed larger than life. I'd see him at conferences and, of course, on TV and things of that sort. And so when I met him, I was surprised. And his biographer that was just mentioned, Robert Harrison, tells about John's stature in a family of big guys doing big things, especially in athletics. I can relate to that because both of my brothers are over 6 foot. So I can appreciate that. But God had something else in mind for John Walker. And he heard the call of God to leave his AME roots and go to a far country known as the Episcopal Church. And we know all about how he has been the first graduate here and a history master at St. Paul's, and then went on to be canon residentiary of the cathedral, the first African American in that particular role, suffragan bishop in diocesan, and then dean of the 6th largest cathedral in the world, and one of the largest nonprofit corporations in metropolitan D.C. That foundation consists not only of the cathedral, but at that time, 3 of the colleges that he had, the 3 schools, other things that were a part of that body, and it was huge. But he took that on. But more importantly, as we all know, John was a faithful man. Not perfect, but faithful. He was faithful to his vocation, to his God, but his quiet but very strong wife And I know, Maria, you had to be an anchor for him. You know the burdens more than any of us know that he had to face in those dual roles as diocesan and as dean. One of the things I love that I heard in a bio, it tells the story. Someone was being interviewed, and they said they remembered John rushing to the athletic field because one of his children was playing, and he was running a little late, and he stumbled and fell. And the person saw him and they said, I don't know, how can I tell people I saw the bishop fall down? But it represents that his family was important to him, very important to him. And I know there was some antics with the kids and so on, but John was, as I am told, and Mark Muller and his son was mixed in it as well, that John approached it not as an embarrassed bishop, but as a concerned parent. And so these things touch me because I know that if we are not faithful to our families, no matter what we accomplish, it will always be marred having failed our first obligation. Well, I'm sure that today the tremendous advances in the ministry of the cathedral would rejoice John's heart, Dean Hollerith, Provost Jan Coate. He would understand, as only a person in that position could understand, the hard decisions about prophetic witness, its finances, its friends, its art, its fabric, and the delicate balance and unpleasantries when that balance must be tilted, especially in the pulpit. I think no more poignant truth with grace spoken from that pulpit was the sermon at the last inaugural by Bishop Mary Ann Buddy. I felt that Paul's statement, speaking the truth with love, and I interpret agape not in terms of some esoteric divine sense of love, and as many of you seminarians or faculty know, it's not just being a buddy. It is having our souls shaped in a way that even with our adversaries, we do not forget the human dignity, the God-given human dignity of that person. We're going to argue, we're going to debate, we may not even talk to each other for a while. But if I give my body to be burned, and I have not that godly respect for the other, it profits nothing. First thing that came to me was that our Bishop John was a collaborator. You know, we can never do great things for God alone. And when the work and successes are only about us, our abilities and our interpretation of the mission is greatly restrained. Bishop John was a man of enormous accomplishments. You've heard many of them shared today. But the important thing for me in this is that his untimely death was something that not only caused great grief, but there was also an element that made people committed to carrying on his vision and his work. He retired more than a $10 million debt. I remember Kowasi telling me John would come in and he'd have this check and he said, somebody else he reached out who decided to embrace the vision. John established the College of Laity, and it's been mentioned, the Free South Africa movement, and also the sense of institutional collaboration to minister and witness. Founding the Faith and Politics Institute, which I was privileged to be a chaplain for for several years during my time here in Washington, which brought together across the aisle Republican and Democrats from the House and the Senate to take a tour of the Civil Rights Trail. It was powerful. But what was special is that John collaborated with Amo Olton and John Lewis to chair it, and then found this young Methodist minister, Tanner, to be its director. It's collaboration, working with others. I know the inspiration for the Interfaith Conference of Greater Washington was an important part of John's heart. Because being someone who had traveled, he understood our world was big. Our world was diverse. And much of the pain was the lack of respect for those who are different in their culture, their religion, their background. And so that organization that he brought together, 11 distinct traditions, even today it continues. And it's still serving hundreds of thousands of people in the metropolitan D.C. area. And of course, as has been mentioned, Africa, incredible. This is something that, with his friend C. Payne Lucas, he loved John. He loved John and admired him. And John became the chair of that board. He had worked with it much longer, but he had become the chair before his death in 1989. They went from a $25,000 loan to underwrite their programs to $35 million to do programs in 26 different countries. And its mission continues today, even though it's under different nomenclatures. And of course, one of the most coveted awards in Washington, D.C., in the private, public, and social sector, is the Bishop John Walker Humanitarian Award. I would be invited to go, and I was amazed. Few places could hold it, that dinner. But the persons who received it were people who come from tremendous backgrounds, high visibility often, but they had to have demonstrated in some way a sense of humanity's need for leadership that cared. C. Payne wrote, he said, Bishop Walker was a significant humanitarian and a peacemaker who dedicated his life to racial justice and the welfare of people, especially in Africa, but also in the United States. The mission continues today. But since his death, things have continued to be inspired. His witness, though he's dead, his witness still collaborates with the vision and passion of others. Just a few examples: the Walker Center for Learning at Holy Comforter Church with Dr. Courtwright Davis at the time, his inspiration, the Walker School. Something that, with all the work that John did, that witness, that passion is alive. And it inspired, and you heard the story from Preston Hannibal and others, and you heard the young men that read. Wasn't that wonderful? It gives you hope because they know they are a part of a community. And so what greater passion and mission to ignite a love for learning and a commitment to serving others. That's Preston Hannibal's tribute to Bishop Walker. Now, all of this with the weight of both the cathedral and the diocese, John Walker allowed God to keep his soul. John was loved and respected, not because he pleased everyone. Some who approached him in Nicodemus' style had been early detractors and often appalled with the voices in the cathedral. That certain things that were done would adulterate the witness of Christ. But John's gifts sagged beneath the weight and demands of these roles. So I stress again, never try to do great things alone. The Lone Ranger had Tonto. Bass Reeves had Grant Johnson. John Walker had Charles Perry. He had, in the diocesan side, he had John Frizzell. And they all reported to Cheryl Daves. Now, that's not just a flower throne. Cheryl was critical in the complexity of people, personalities, both regarding how it affected the diocese, John's life, and those who worked with him. And I have to say that, Cheryl, your ministry not only blessed John and those who worked with him, but so many of the bishop's secretaries who have come together over years. You were their mentor and you were their tutor, and my secretary just talked all Carolyn Patterson about what a gift you were. And just like a bishop walks into a position and you don't know what's going on and you're whatever, when a person is asked to be the executive assistant, and I guess BESS stands for
Bishop's Executive Assistants Together.
And so I just want to thank you, Cheryl, because, and we know in the House of Bishops how much you have been a gift to us as well. Now, Charles Perry was appointed to the cathedral as the provost by John. He had previously served as the executive officer for the Diocese of Washington. So he was responsible for the day-to-day operations, but he was also a partner in relieving the debt that was so heavy for the cathedral. And there were times when the heads banged. I remember that Charles, and I often say to people, because the difference in their spirit and experience, good Christians. But, John was about the Sermon on the Mount. And Charles Perry, with his MPA, wanted to preach on the Sermon of the Mount. But they worked together. They worked together. And all the canons, I just have to note those during John's time, he had around him really strong and able people. Lloyd Casson, great preacher and activist. Carol Crumley, sweet little red-haired white girl from Tennessee, who was deeply spiritual. She had a vocation of spiritual directing. And today, the Spirituality and Pilgrimage Center has come out of that collaboration with her and Virginia Mars. And then there was Michael Hamilton. We used to always joke about how Michael Hamilton would dress. It was like he just went by with his eyes shut and grabbed something out the mission barrel and showed up. But he was a theologian and an ethicist. And he got upset with me when I told him that. He had that sort of Irish modesty. But I remember that among the things he did, he brought together admirals and generals on a number of occasions to sit and talk about military power, about nuclear power. And they would be in a public gathering in the cathedral to discuss these issues. And it takes a certain person to be able to bring together, not Hedgeworth, I know he's bringing them all together now, but, to do this sort of thing. And of course, legendary Wayne Dirks, a longtime choir master and a layman, whom John made the presenter over worship and music. And then little Kwasi Thorndown, my buddy, a young priest, an urban guerrilla. Kwasi had more contacts in the grassroots communities of activists than anyone I knew. But John nurtured them, trusted them, honored their gifts, and allowed their ministries to influence him, as well as the life of the cathedral. They and so many of the ordained lay ministers in John's tenure became inspiration for another generation. Well, we lost John Walker too soon. But yet in death, his witness to the gospel continues. And consider all the diverse collaborators, religious, social, and political, that continue and mark his ministry. I read one biography article, and it said, on September 29, 1989, the day chosen to mark the beginning of a full year's celebration of the cathedral's completion. You heard that? The cathedral's completion. When he came on, there was this debt. Many people had promised they were going to give money, and Dean Sayre, who I'll speak about in a little bit, said, let's push on and get this thing completed. He didn't have Charles Perry there to preach to him about the Sermon on the Mount. But that he believed that these persons were going to come through. And of course, the economy changed and everything. And so when he left the cathedral, it was not only not completed, but deeply, deeply in debt. So when he had come to that place, God allowed him to just look over into Canaan. Just look over at the promised land. And he died on the day at the beginning of that celebration. But reading the accounts of that day, you can feel grief rising from the page, the stunned sense of loss and immediate resolve, though, to carry forth his work. I know I felt the pressure and weight, the community energy when I served as dean. Did you know Bishop Walker? Bishop Walker's vision was this. Bishop Walker always said this. However, it was the fact that he understood who he was and whose he was. As you all know, I ain't always been an Episcopalian. They used to be Kojic. But I love this gospel song. You may build great cathedrals, large or small. You can build skyscrapers, grand and tall. You may conquer all the failures of your past, but only what you do for Christ will last. John believed that. I believe that. Next, John was a pastor, a person of inspiring spiritual integrity. And I felt that and heard that when I came. I'll never forget Richard Cornish Martin, who loved Bishop Walker so much. And very, very early in my tenure, he came by and he said, I just want to say to you, keep prayer going in this cathedral. He said, if you do, with the prayers that have already gone up, Nathan, it's going to get in the bricks. It's going to get in the stone. This will be a holy place because prayers have saturated into the very life of the fabric. And I used to love to say to my chapter and to the foundation boards, there is such a thing as the ministry of the fabric. When there's not an organ playing, there's not a choir singing, when there's not a great liturgy that is happening, I have seen so many people who have been moved and brought closer to God just sitting in that place. And not just its aesthetic beauty, but just the sense of God's peace. Now, I want to be very clear. I never had a personal relationship with Bishop Walker. But many times I was privileged to be in his presence, encounters with him at the wonderful acolyte festivals, visiting the cathedral with my youth groups when I was in the parish, at conferences, and of course experiencing him on Christmas Day. That telecast was just tremendous. And then after coming in 91, there were very lively and passionate and humorous stories about him. You know, Dean Markham, John was true to the Protestant Episcopal Theological Seminary in Virginia. I know y'all use a different name now, but that evangelical spirit of preaching, of mission and missionary work. If he hadn't done missionary work, he would have missed out on something real special, but I'll talk about that later. John was low church. Ratchet and Shamir. Finally, some of the young folks got him to put on a coat and mitre, but he was Ratchet and Shamir. Fred Williams, Canon Fred Williams from New York, Anglo-Catholic, and he was talking one day and he said, you know, liturgically, I tell you, that cathedral is so low. He said, Nathan is earthworm low. John was a conservative in many ways. He was conservative on these various avant-garde social matters of his day. A true conservative leader is always asking these questions. What is there of value to preserve as we make change? It's not just about change, but it's being thoughtful and considering what needs to be preserved. It asks how much of the gospel or the spirit of the gospel is being compromised for our tactics towards justice and change. John supported women's ordination, but he believed such things should be the decisions of the church. And so when the 11 were ordained, and a number of them were my friends, and we shared together on the faculty of EDS, but John was a churchman. He believed that the church has to keep struggling forward, and that the discipline and the actions of the church and our polity, and not an imposition on a few dissenting bishops. And so because of who he was asked to oversee the committee to investigate what had happened. And what should we do with those bishops and those who were ordained? And it was in that commission that it was decided that it was sacramentally efficacious. So it was not something that was invalid. It was just irregular. That's a pastor. That's a pastor. In my years, my early years, I would run into hardened corporate leaders, bankers, media leaders, political leaders, young professionals, who would come up to me and they'd ask, did you know Bishop Walker? And all the stories they told me, not about his achievements, but how he touched their personal lives, how his presence with them, even without word, made changes in their lives. How in board meetings and corporate gatherings, his pastoral, non-anxious presence affected the members when struggling with difficult divisions and often influenced their decisions. But again, big money is also conservative money. And I don't mean that John Walker was a Ronald Reagan or Mitch McConnell. But somehow his spirit of conserving and respecting broke down a lot of barriers. And I'm going to tell you, John Walker got honey from the rock, the hardest rock. He often diametrically opposed the ideas of some with whom he worked, volunteers and others who were major corporate persons in the D.C. area. He often opposed their ideas and their methods. He would say so. But they came to know that he respected their right to think. He respected their right to think what they thought. And he showed them there is a way to have a respectful discussion without compromising the gospel and without compromising true justice. Not revenge, not make you pay back for whatever, or let's just change this, doesn't matter, by any means necessary, no. And so they found in John a real pastor. And I know that this was true in the house of bishops, where John was often a person who quietly worked various positions and posts. And he did it in such a way that he was calling the house to integrity. Calling the house to integrity. I often think of when I was in the house of bishops, and there was a group of us new bishops, and we were sitting at small tables, and we were having a discussion after we had passed a particular decision for the canons that was very controversial. And it had been kind of rushed through. So we're sitting at the table talking about how we're going to tell the people in our diocese when we get back. And so we were talking about, well, you know, if you look at this scripture and you consider it this way, you know, the canons can be interpreted in this way. And we were just going on in circles. Finally, this very senior bishop was sitting at the table. He didn't say anything. And then he said, you know, times like this make me think of Hezekiah 2 and 4. Hezekiah. I know it said, was it a book, 2 and 4? And we were embarrassed to ask him more. We hadn't gone to Virginia. We would have known that. And so we finally turned to him and we said, Bishop, well, what is Hezekiah 2 and 4? He said, well, Hezekiah 2 and 4 says, a lie is an abomination unto the Lord, and a very present help in the time of trouble. So we got the message.
Oh, okay. Thank you. You hear me better now? But there was another situation that for me represented the depth of his integrity, his spiritual life, his gift as a leader who had the way to engage people that came deep down. 1985, at the General Convention, there was the election for our presiding bishop. And you are correct, I talked to a number of bishops, especially black bishops, who were there at that time. And when the news came down that, the first was when they said they're going to take a break, because John was way ahead. And some of the old priests said, oh, that's not good. That's not good. And then that block prevailed. And John was not elected. And I was sitting in the room with a lot of UBE leaders, laity, priests, others. And the older priests were literally crying, tears coming out of their eyes. Some of the young Turks, Ed Rodden, Kwasi, Earl Neal, some of those, Barry Hyde, you know, some of those who influenced General Convention special program, you know, and it took the mic and took over things, and they were talking about what they were going to do, and, you know, it was just and about that time, Bishop Walker came into the room with Maria on his arm. He had his back against the wall, and we all turned. And he said, I know you're disappointed, and I'm disappointed also. But I have work to do at home, and you have work to do at home. So don't let disappointment keep you from doing what God is calling you to do. And then he turned around and went out. It was like somebody let all the air out of that balloon. it was that sense that even though injustice sometimes prevails, and especially in politics, and the church invented politics, of course. And so sometimes when things happen, it causes us to lose a sense of who we are and whose we are. Next, we never enter roles of public and moral institutional life without the way being prepared. When I was serving in rural Virginia, there were a number of new pastors. I was at St. Paul's, but I also had the chapel. So a number of the new pastors were invited to this pastor's group. And the fellow who was the chair or presider was a great big Southern Baptist pastor, buttons about to pop on his vest. So he looked around at us and he said, it was all guys, he said, fellas, I have one thing to tell you. Avoid the since I came syndrome. Somebody was here before you. Somebody left something before you. And there will be others who will have the opportunity to do even more if you do what you need to do. Avoid the since I came syndrome. And as a seminary dean and professor, I've so often heard, oh, since I came, we did this since I came. Significant institutional leadership is never in a vacuum. Moral and spiritual leadership in the plan of God towards justice in the beloved community, what the great lay theologian Werner Dozier called the dream of God. I believe God is working out the divine purpose, using flawed servants like you and me and the Babel-like towers we build. To me, this means God is always calling us in our own time to the work of not just building, but preparing the way. There are always forerunners. John the Baptist, he wanted to know, is he the one to come? Tell him, And Jesus did not send him his resume. He just said, God's work is going on. John said, okay. John came to the cathedral as the second African-American residential canon. He came not as an honorary canon. Of course, residential means that you are resident and you have vote and voice when the canons gather. The National Cathedral had brought on a man by the name of John Burgess. John was at Howard as one of the chaplains. Right. But he came on as what they called in those times, they called it a non-stipend volunteer. Now that meant you got a little bit of remuneration to respect the gifts you might be bringing, but you were not on the salary list. At the time, Dean invited others to that role of non-stipendary volunteers, or others later called it paid volunteers. This was in practice when I came on as Dean of the Cathedral in '91. It was an arrangement between the cathedral and some persons with special expertise or professional experience who would function as a staff member with a very, very modest stipend. Now, John had full responsibility in a part-time way, preaching, celebrating, doing various kinds of ministries. I remember John Burgess telling me he would take the bus to the cathedral. And they would say, Reverend, where are you going? He says, oh, I'm preaching at the cathedral today. And it would get quiet. And he said one time the bus driver refused to stop at the stop of the cathedral because he couldn't believe a black man was going to be preaching at that cathedral. Every year, Mary Ellen and I went to Martha's Vineyard, spent a couple of weeks, and we would take time to visit the homes of our friends, Dean and Mrs. Sayre, and then we go to Bishop and Mrs. Burgess. And among the story they told us was their experiences in the cathedral in those particular days. However, Dean Sayre said that they had an understanding that the task was to begin integrating the leadership of the cathedral and the foundation. And normally the meetings when the National Cathedral Association would come or there would be major donor appreciations, it would be held at one of the prestigious Washington social clubs. But when John Burgess came on, they said, well, you know, we can't serve him there. He can't come. He can't. And so they said, so can we just ask him if he would just not come to those particular meetings, but do everything else? Dean Sayre said, no. From now on, we will have those meetings in your homes. And when we came on, Mary Ellen and I, that was one of the real responsibilities we had, was hosting NCA and diplomats and so on, because that legacy continued. And so I cite that to say, for too many, if progress doesn't come in the manner or character they deem either appropriate or just, we criticize it, we ignore it, we forget it. But I love the text in Zechariah. Do not despise these small beginnings, for the Lord rejoices to see the work begin, to see the plumb line, the symbol of justice, in the hands of those who have authority. Now, of course, Dean Sayre was the grandchild of Woodrow Wilson, the oldest one, and his Woodrow Wilson was, well, I just said, he was an unapologetic racist and a believer in the lost cause. And John's family, his father, his uncles, mother, were all those noblesse oblige persons who were status and wealth, but they wanted to serve as ambassadors and, you know, special appointments and so on. In fact, D.W. Griffith's movie, Birth of a Nation, was premiered in the White House the same year that Sayre was born. But Frank was the first dean to consistently use the power of the great Canterbury pulpit prophetically. He was a voice and an active opponent of segregation, poverty, the Vietnam War, and particularly McCarthyism. You know, we sometimes forget there have been other bad days like these days. I mean, lives ruined by this whole Red Scare, this whole accusation of, and it was a way of getting rid of folks you didn't like. It didn't matter whether they were really communist sympathizers or whatever. And so this was a kind of time when people were deathly afraid to speak out, afraid to tell certain things to friends because the friends might then turn them in. It's true that John was a part of the invitation for Martin Luther King to come, but nobody comes to the Canterbury Cathedral unless the dean says they can come. And so, like John, he marched in the civil rights movement and had Martin Luther King come. I mentioned it here earlier, Koji. Well, his last sermon was at the cathedral, but his last speech was at Mason Temple. But he was unafraid, Sayre, to speak, and during the height of the McCarthy era, he said from the pulpit, McCarthy is a pretend patriot, and there is a devilish indecision about any society that will permit an imposter like McCarthy to caper out in front of the main army as they stand idly by. Sound familiar? Now, I say that to say, no significant institutional leader in the process of ministry and change is never in a vacuum. The shoulders we stand on may be imperfect. We may not always recognize or know their work, but the institutional decisions and bold witnesses they dare to make are steps for another generation to carry on the God-ordained institutional ministry. And those persons may be black, white, male, female, high-born, low-born, gay, straight, undecided, but even there, God can use them to help prepare the way. And therefore, it becomes our obligation to ask, and how can I, in my time, prepare the way? I recently heard a presentation by Darren Walker, who is, some of you know him, 10th president of the Ford Foundation, and also president of the National Gallery. And he said this that really moved me. He said, whenever we help the social justice visionaries of this generation to build next, at its foundation will be the staff, the rod that they have given us. Because like those who came before them and those who will follow, they are passionate about this place, this country, this mission, and the enduring legacy we leave. So in this way, one of the most indispensable elements of our culture is stewardship across generations. We are not just stewards of what we help to build, but the hard work and intellectual rigor of our predecessors. Together, we are part of an unbroken chain of commitments to social justice that reaches back to our earliest years and stretches far ahead of us. What a thrill, he says, to recognize the power inherent in that intergenerational bond. That intergenerational bond. I think very often that the idea of working with another generation can be difficult. You know, John Lewis is a good friend. And, you know, he worked a lot with young people. And in fact, in his last march, it was with Black Lives Matter young people and on Black Lives Matter Square. And like John, caring for and nurturing young people can be a challenge. It sounds noble. But, you know, John would say, man, he said, we used to wear business suits and the ladies wore their Sunday best. He said, these kids got piercing everywhere. They got rainbow colored hair. You know, they don't worry about how they dress, you know, t-shirt and this and that. He said, but they're our leaders now. They're our leaders. They're black and brown and white. They come from different sexual identities, but they are committed and willing to collaborate for justice. For justice. And that's coming from John, who really believed, what I'm trying to think, Congressman, John Lewis, who believed in order, who believed in the structure of things to get things done, even though he said that doing legislation is like watching sausage being made. But he felt that. And of course, John really believed in the order and the life of the Episcopal Church in his worship. But I think also they somehow, looking at a new generation, had an openness that, you know, they're going to be different. You know, we'll pass the baton on, but if we work with them and encourage them. And I think of a story about a seminary in Kentucky. In the line, the cafeteria, right at the beginning was this big, beautiful brass bowl. and it was filled with apples that had been polished. And there was a beautiful handwritten sign that said, "Only take one. God is watching." The dean said at the end of the cafeteria line, someone had taken those old yellow or green trays and taken big boxes of butter cookies and dropped them all in there and messed around. And it said, "Take as much as you want. God's at the other end watching the apples." The final thing I want to lift up is the importance of how we go about the work of justice without losing our soul. How we go about the work of building the kingdom in our time, but remain faithful. As one of my professors said, remember, God does not call us to be successful. God calls us to be faithful. I think so much as I read about John, but also John Walker, how with all the things he dealt with in public and political life, the toll it took on him, no question about that. But he was able to keep his authentic sense of integrity. He may have gone home and slammed the door and said a few words that couldn't be repeated. But when he engaged the public, I've seen in my time some incredible moral and political leaders who eventually become consumed by the fire of their passion. Friedrich Nietzsche, the existentialist philosopher, he said this or wrote this, and I love this quote. "Beware that when fighting monsters, you yourself do not become a monster. For when you gaze long into the abyss gazes also into you." It is a warning that when we are fighting evil, we can find ourselves becoming the evil we deplore. Our job is to be salt and light. God's got a lot of ingredients in that mix that he has for working justice in the beloved community. I think of Micah 6. God has told you, O mortal, what is good. And what does the Lord require? To do justice, love kindness, and walk humbly with your God. Do. It means we have an inescapable duty to do the work of justice. But love kindness, it implies something in our spirit, in our heart, that it's, as Bishop Buddy said, having mercy deep in our soul, that the work of justice never overwhelms our love of kindness. But how do you hold those two together? How do you hold them together? The Lord says we should walk humbly with God. He will keep us balanced. He will keep us balanced. The work of justice in the beloved community is not ours. It's God's. We cannot forget that. Though sometimes I know I can hardly wait. I'm anxious. It's been, how long, oh Lord, how long? Bishop Martin preached, Richard B. Martin preached at my installation as dean, and I close with this. He said, remember, Nathan, The mission of justice is God's, not your mission. It's God's mission. We are only on errand for God.